Castlevania, colloquially called Castlevania 64, for good reason as that naming convention was everywhere on the Nintendo 64, is the worst game I kinda love. It's ambitious, looks good for the console, has solid music, and tons of great ideas. It's also clunky, awkward, stupidly difficult, near every jump in the game is an insta-death if failed, it's blatantly unfinished, half the game lacks music, thanks cartridges, and a lot of its goodwill is built up in a solid introduction to come crashing down midway through. Castlevania was the series' first swing at 3D and is largely a conversion of classicvania to the new dimension, a heavily action-focused platformer with horror makeup, multiple characters to extend runtime as in Castlevania III, and a largely linear design with a few areas that are a bit more exploratory to mix things up. Beginning development at Konami in early 1997, the game had a turbulent development that led to the number of playable characters getting axed from 4 to 2, and eventually launched in January 1999 in the United States, and a few months later in other regions, which places it towards the tail end of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, and it really shows, as the game is fairly impressive in some areas, and notably also places it after the release of Symphony of the Night, a really tough act to follow even if this game was way better than it is. Castlevania takes a lot of cues from the classic-style Castlevania games, keeping things simple and straightforward with only a few notable changes beyond the whole 3D thing. Reinhard Schneider is the new vampire killer this time around. Set in 1852, he's probably Richter's grandson, although this game is considered an alternate universe as of now. Dracula's 100-year absence brings up a lot of questions, especially as it gets in the way of Order of Ecclesia and Bloodlines. The game was once to be set in World War II, but evidently that was considered too big a leap, and they scaled it back to just being set in the mid-1800s. Reinhardt plays a lot like his forebears. His primary weapon is a whip, it has decent range, it's a bit slow, but the game does its best to automatically lock onto targets in your general direction, which it does relatively well. This game really could have used a system like Zelda's Z targeting though. Aiming can be incredibly unreliable, especially on fast enemies. In addition to this, there are 4 sub-weapons, which use crystals as a resource almost exactly like prior games, and serve to give Reinhardt longer range or otherwise different options. The dagger is the least expensive to use and flies in a straight line at a target. It's virtually useless as it does next to no damage. The axe flies in an arc to its target and does substantially more damage. It's very useful very often. Holy water is the most unique. When used, it creates a very damaging burst of fire on the ground and leaves lingering fire that deals a small amount of damage over time. It absolutely shreds slower stationary bosses and enemies, and it's basically a staple. And the cross hits hard as hell and can potentially get another hit on the trip back, but because it returns to you by going up, it's unreliable to get that second hit at best. Basically, the axe and holy water are useful in almost every situation. Reinhardt can also slide like Richter in his games. It's used to avoid obstacles in one stage and never used elsewhere, so I didn't really know where else to mention it. Alongside jumping, this is basically more or less what you'd see in a classicvania game. However, this game has to make a few concessions and additions in order to function. Namely the short sword, which can be swung with the left C button, how comfortable. An axe is a get off me move in the event something comes from the sides or behind, where the whip is functionally useless, and is a pretty integral part of Reinhardt's moveset as far as it goes, giving you a decent, very, very short range option in a pinch. Reinhardt can also cling to and climb ledges, a concession made somewhat necessary by inherent unclarity that this game's camera in 3D would invent, as boy, this game has a lot of platforming, and in nearly every instance, failure is an instant death and back to the last activated save crystal, which can be as far back as never in some levels. To rip the band-aid off now, the game does not come together well at all. When it comes to platforming anyway. The combat is honestly fine. It's clunky and awkward, but responsive, fast-paced, and enemies and bosses rarely do too much damage at once. Plus, being able to stockpile healing in the new inventory alongside cures that heal the vampire and poison statuses means that if you're managing your money well, searching for hidden food, and playing it safe, you're usually going to be okay. On the other hand, the platforming is rough, and the first thread to pick at is the camera. No manual way to center it, no manual control at all. Come on guys, Mario 64 had been out for ages and Ocarina of Time beat you to the punch by 6 months. Instead, the camera has 4 modes, which do their best to make the game playable, usually not spectacularly. Normal mode just lets the camera do whatever. It kinda stays behind you, kinda focuses on enemies, kinda tries to look at nothing, never use normal mode. Action mode keeps the camera behind you at all times, mostly reliably, although this comes with its own issues when you need to make small adjustments, like by turning around, which turns the camera around, but comes close enough to functional that you're kinda stuck with it. And battle and boss mode focus the camera on the currently targeted enemy, which is situationally great, although the targeting tends to schizo out a bit. And if an enemy spawns to your left, it can get disorienting fast. It's one that you kinda gotta use sometimes, but it's far from perfect. Platforming similarly feels unreliable. For one, you jump like a cat, easily twice your height, and have very little air control. You will over and undershoot jumps like crazy in slight speed variations, and will almost 100% of the time die instantly for it. The ledge grab is equally unreliable, as it sometimes just doesn't work for seemingly no reason. Probably like 5% of the time you just do not grab and die instantly. And of course, you guessed it, that means death. Not that it helps with overshoots anyways, as it only grabs edges you're basically 90 degrees facing. It's really hard to defend the platforming in this game. You run too fast, jump too far, jump too little, and every single time you're going back to the last save, and they are not generous. Expect some grueling 15-minute sections of unreliable platforming. If the game had focused more on combat, it would be not great, but it would have been a serviceable little game. Focusing as much on the platforming as it does, with it being a majority of every level, sans a handful of exploratory levels, really makes the game miserable. Oh yeah, there's a second character too, with a few tweaks to her levels, a few unique levels, and a new playstyle. Carrie Fernandez is the mage of the game in the vein of Sypha and Maria from prior games. However, it's clear due to the unfinished nature of the game that she's not quite as fleshed out or finished, really. Outside of her much shorter statue, she plays identically to Reinhardt in all ways but her primary weapon, dropping the whip for a magical spell which can be charged to increase its damage and homes in on enemies. And if it kills an enemy but still has damage left to deal, it can pass through them onto another nearby enemy, something more noticeable as you collect power-ups for it. Reinhardt can also get these power-ups, but they simply increase the whip's damage and range very slightly, and since you lose them on death, you're rarely going to have them anyway. You also lose them if you save the game, quit, and reload, which is really fun and cool. Carrie's often called this game's easy mode, and that's sometimes true. She can cheese a lot of enemies and even some bosses by just running away and letting magic do all the work, but other bosses are significantly worse. Bosses and enemies that summon other enemies are very hard to get magic to target properly. True Dracula is True Dracula, and we'll get into that, and so on. Plus, arguably, her unique levels are more difficult, that means more platforming focused, than Reinhardt's equivalents, although for the early part of the game, before the part most people quit at, it's true that she generally tends to be easier. Castlevania is a huge mixed bag presentation-wise, in part because it's clearly unfinished. For what it's worth, the character models for the player and enemies, no complaints there. Extremely detailed, smoothly animated, well-textured. The huge bosses like the skeleton are especially gorgeous, and it does a great job of capturing the Castlevania anime realistic style. Some levels are fantastic too. The villa is the big standout, and probably the game's most obviously finished level, with each room having unique elements just for it, like a gorgeous rose room, a bedroom that looks clean but lived in, and the hedge maze, but several other stages have some nice touches too. The intro is very strong with the simple rain effect and lightning that can destroy trees in the environments, detailed mausoleums and sections of broken bridges, and even a few later levels like the Tower of Sorcery and Tower of Science have unique settings and lots of detail. But also, most levels are 10 minutes long, lack any detail, and are made entirely of gray bricks, and ditch the sense of realism and naturalism built up in the early levels. Areas like the castle wall, the Duel Tower, most of the castle center, and the Room of Clocks feel like there wasn't enough time to give them a second pass to spruce them up beyond the initial prototype. The music feels the same blow. What's actually here is pretty incredible, as is the standard for Castlevania, especially the Bloody Tears and Bloodlines renditions. But also, Wikipedia says the soundtrack is ambient and minimalist, and that's a very generous interpretation of one of two scenarios. One, it didn't fit on the cart, a real possibility for the Nintendo 64, or two, it wasn't done, and considering this game has levels for characters that were cut from the game entirely, it leaves a bad impression. Although when the music kicks in, it usually goes hard. The game performs surprisingly well, given the N64, where even okay performance is rare, with even the larger levels like the Forest of Silence running quite smoothly, with only one minor exception, the Tower of Execution, which chugs so comically that you can't help but wonder why they even tried. The game starts with its strongest foot forward, with a fairly good first set of levels that feel pretty finished, have a lot of detail, and even connect to each other in realistic ways, something dropped as the game gets to the obviously less finished parts. Both characters share the same levels for the most part, although I will note when they split off or when levels change some, mostly in the form of unique bosses. The Forest of Silence is basically a trick. It leaves a killer first impression, and there's only one more level that even comes close. The area is large, fairly open, with branching paths every which way, some backtracking, and notably little platforming, with one kind of difficult section in the middle, but mostly being fairly generous, with large, level, stationary platforms made of segments of broken bridges. There's still instant death if you fail though. A sign of things to come, I suppose. The level is moody and atmospheric. It lacks music entirely, which is a shame, but the rain is cool, and the game starts off with a bang as the lightning takes out a tree right in front of you. And even though that one's scripted, if you dawdle too long, the rain can return and strike other trees. It happens to me, and it kinda blew my mind. The forest is mostly populated with skeletons, a solid training enemy. They shamble around after you, die quickly, and don't hurt much, and some variants appear as the stage goes on, with red ones that spam projectiles and blue ones that kamikaze themselves. Enemies in most area of the game, this one included, infinitely respawn, which can get very exhausting. The one enemy that doesn't is the werewolf mini-boss, which is fast as hell, jumps constantly, and is a bizarre addition to this level, given it's probably harder than the boss, probably harder than the next 3 bosses. The boss, though, is great, maybe the best in the game. A giant skeleton that runs like a gorilla summons standard skeletons and every few hits flees, entirely leaving for a while before coming back as an encore at the end. It's extremely well animated, gigantic, can be a pain, but not too much of one, and when it dies, its skeletal remains stay on the map, and this level smoothly transitions into the next as you enter the castle wall, which is great attention to detail that makes the whole world feel connected and real. Don't get too used to it. The castle wall is the first sign of things to come. It's not horrendous, but is mostly a platforming level, with 2 massive towers with narrow platforms to jump across, moving platforms, collapsing platforms, weird rotating platforms that drop you off of them, and enemies to hit you in midair, and it's all instant death, of course, with a single checkpoint at the start that can be reused between the 2 towers. The first one has a boss, a twin-headed dragon that shoots fireballs or streams of fire, and after each head dies, it revives once again into a bone dragon. It's very stationary and therefore dies in seconds to holy water, but it can be a bit of a jump scare. The second tower has no boss and kinda just ends with you exiting out into the villa. The interconnectedness is nice, but it's the first sign that things in this game aren't very finished, I suppose. The villa is easily the game's strongest and most finished area. The whole game should have taken notes. After a short introduction with a group of hellhounds, which themselves can be a fucking pain, especially since they come in packs, you're kinda just left to explore the villa. There's no platforming, and honestly not a ton of combat either. There's 4 or 5 vampires you fight throughout that don't respawn. They're fairly fast enemies that can cause the vampire status condition. A couple rooms have a few ghosts, but honestly it's kinda just chill. The villa isn't that complex, but it's stuffed with cool stuff to find. Unique areas like the Rose Room, which holds one of the game's only timed events, as both characters need to arrive at dawn to meet Rosa, a vampire who retains most of her humanity, and the day-night cycle in this game is otherwise so superfluous that it barely comes into play, and after this point it's basically only used to open optional day and night doors for a few items, just like healing items and other standard stuff. Rosa isn't even the only character here, as Vincent, an older vampire hunter, also hangs around and chides both characters for their age and inexperience. He's also kind of a remnant of an older NPC system where this game was supposed to have a ton of NPCs that would die if you didn't get to them in time, and he kinda wanders around in a very, very tiny Majora's Mask-like fashion where he'll like go through routines throughout the day, but he's basically the only NPC you interact with outside of a cutscene, so I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. You also meet Renan, the shopkeeper and self-admitted demon, who sells you supplies from contracts that can be found throughout the game. The design, as serious and quiet businessman, is quite good. It also feels like a real game with big production values for a bit. There's lots of cutscenes, there's lots of events, there's people to talk to, NPCs, you're exploring, you're finding things. Exploring is nice, it's relaxing, there's no insta-death via bad jumping. I wish the game had more of this. You meet Malice, a young boy who looks like and has the name of a supervillain who runs away and guides the player through the maze to escape the two dogs and the gardener. A Frankenstein's monster meets Ash from Evil Dead creature that was created using the model of one of the cut characters, Collar. They have a cool dynamic, and I quite like the area. The dogs can outrun and grab you, which tees up the slow gardener for a quick kill, but the secret is that the short sword is extremely good for dealing with these idiots, and it's really fun to time it to knock the dogs around. It's really just the ending of the villa that kinda spells the doom of this level. No clean, realistic transition. You fight some vampires in a tomb, then jump in a coffin that somehow lowers you down into the next stage, which begins with you just kinda standing in the next one, and every stage after basically plays out in this same way. The underground areas are the first branches, with each character having a unique but thematically similar stage. Reinhardt goes to the tunnel, and it's the first truly bad stage. The tunnel isn't difficult, it's boring. A good majority of it is running through caves, fighting spider centaurs, the designs are cool though, and doing some janky type platforming above instant death acid water. The one element that does work is the brief ride on the trolleys, which is a unique little challenge and has a fun moment where you need to jump over a weird thing that comes at you, but it doesn't save what largely feels like the first pass at a level. At the end of the tunnel, it suddenly transitions into a developed building, and Reinhardt sees Rosa again, attempting to use sunlight to kill herself, but he can't bring himself to let her die. It's a nice moment for both of them. Carrie instead gets a substantially more finished seeming underground waterway. Bad, but closer to finished. The waterway looks cool, a series of bridges and gaps that connect over more poisoned water, and focusing on flipping switches to shut off flowing water or open doors, all while dodging fishmen that jump out of the water to bother Carrie fucking constantly. As cool as it sounds, it's largely a platforming level, and a really tedious one at that, with lots of precise jumps on small platforms and walks across extremely narrow pathways, all while fishmen try to push you off. It's pretty dreadful, honestly. The pathway also spits out Carrie in the same building, however she meets Actrice, a vampire and witch who is working on reviving Dracula, apparently, and extends an offer for Carrie to join her. And then there's the infamous Castle Center. Unlike the hedge maze, I got no defense, it's dreadful. The castle center is similar to the villa, no platforming, wide open exploratory level. There's a few cool things to find here and there, the giant gears that act as platforms, the room of old machinery with no clear use, the giant bull carcass that definitely won't be a boss, possessed armor that comes to life and jump scares you, lizard men. It's not the villa, but it has bits and pieces of polish, and it's all ruined by the most tedious level design ever conceived. If you know one thing about this game, it's probably the magical nitro, and it's honestly worse than you probably know. Although honestly, easier than you'd expect. After making it to the top of the area, you need to carry magical nitro all the way down. Get hit, dead. Jump, dead. It's not that difficult in all honesty. The action camera makes the narrow pass section fairly free. The gears are so comically slow that you'll probably be bored to sleep before you get killed by them, and there's a little bit of a finicky bit at the end of them, but basically the only mean part in this section is the skeletons on motorcycles that patrol outside the door to the Bull's room. They're a little bit hard to dodge, but you can kinda just sprint past them. The real issue is that this song and dance takes several minutes, then when it's done you need to go back to the top, meet the nice lizard man to get the storeroom key, place the other nitro, which is near him thankfully. At this point you meet Malice, who is much less subtle about who he actually is, and both characters are still somehow confused by this. Go back to the bottom to get the Mandragora to use as a trigger for the magical nitro that's apparently so unstable that jumping sets it off, as if you couldn't just use a sub-weapon on it. Go all the way back up to the top to blow up the wall by the lizardmen, solve a pretty neat puzzle where you place statues on a model of the solar system in accordance with hints from statues spread throughout the level, run all the way back down a final time, get a second Mandragora, and blow up the wall by the bull. If that sounds tedious, time-consuming, and exhausting, it is. It's dreadful filler to pad the runtime of a game that would otherwise be like 2 hours long. The bullfight is cool though. I love giant bosses, and it's cool as hell that as you attack different parts of it, they fall apart, eventually just leaving bone. You can even outright destroy its hind legs and leave it slowly crawling around to be finished off. Also choose lasers. What more could you really want? At this point, each character has their own boss on the way out. Reinhardt's forced to fight Rosa, who's trying to force you to kill her to end her curse, and who's kind of an interesting match for using her magic to play keep away, although it ends up being kind of forgettable. Carrie instead fights her deceased cousin, a Fernandez who had come to the castle to fight Dracula in the past and is now a vampire. She's equally a keep away magic spammer, but this is kinda less interesting for Carrie, as that's also what you're doing. Most bosses are very tedious and boring as Carrie, since you kinda just sprint around letting your magic do all the work, unless you want to abuse some sub-weapons. Each character then enters 2 unique towers in a row, each character having one made especially for them, and each having one that was meant for one of the cut characters. Why the hell did they make these levels before the characters were finished? We'll never know. Reinhardt goes to the Duel Tower, a level designed for Cornell, one of the cut characters, a werewolf who was supposed to have a more beat-em-up, combat-heavy playstyle. Now technically this is speculation on my part, and most people's, but the fact that this level is 4 mini-boss fights in a row against beastmen, a werewolf, a werecat, a minotaur, and a weretiger, I feel fairly safe in that assessment. This level took me 4 hours. The platforming is tough, precise, and the spinning spikes love to knock you into the acid below. Every jump is potential death, plus there are literally 0 checkpoints in this level. However, what I didn't realize is that the first Nintendo 64 controller I used had a slight dead zone that prevented me from reaching full speed, thus making the final jump literally impossible. I thought I was just bad, but no, the game requires you to have a perfectly functioning controller. Good luck with that. Once I switched controllers, I got it in one try. The level is short and easy as hell outside of 2 tight jumps, but I do have a burning hatred of it now. Carrie instead goes to the Tower of Science, which was made for Collar, who was supposed to use a shotgun, and the stage is a very large weapons factory covered in turrets that shoot bullets at you, conveyor belts covered in cubes of trash, and explosive munitions. And that's about it really. The stage is pretty short, and while it's visually interesting with weird creatures floating in test tubes, it feels like the level was never really finished. You just zip through a few rooms dodging bullets and it ends in like 10 minutes. The area is also kind of incongruent, setting-wise, it feels a bit too advanced. Never mind that Dracula's been dead for 100 years to not make all this technological progress. But it's also an odd contrast to the magic-focused Carrie in a way that even the Duel Tower isn't. Reinhardt's actual tower is the Tower of Execution. It's a fairly basic platform area that's fairly straightforward and not too mean. It even has checkpoints, how novel. Like the other towers, this one is short, centering itself around a tower in the middle that has giant guillotines falling through it, which do an impressive job of tanking the game's performance. It borders on comedic how terrible this area runs, as it's all one large room. You can also see the remnants of a cut feature, in that there's hooks hanging around the level. At one point in development, these hooks were going to be used by Reinhardt to whip across large gaps. That feature was never finished, so they just sloppily put platforms around and made it a regular level. There's not much more to say, honestly. It's straightforward, not terrible, not great, works well enough besides the performance. Carrie's unique tower is the Tower of Sorcery, and what the hell were they thinking? A large black void with stained glass windows, a cool visual, even if Kingdom Hearts did it better. The stage is 2 lengthy sections of platforming across extremely small crystals, some of which disappear and reappear periodically like in Mega Man. It's the most precise platforming in the game by far, and the stage's singular checkpoint is far from generous. It's still better than the castle center, but that's a very, very low bar. Carrie may be easy mode early on, but she certainly isn't as it comes towards the end. The towers dump both characters in the room of clocks. The stage is essentially just a boss arena, with each character getting their own. Reinhardt gets the classic death fight. The boss is really cool. Death's design is great. The attack where he summons a giant zombie fish is the sickest shit in this game. But it's surprisingly easy. He kind of just floats around throwing very weak sights, and you kind of just jump and mash. It's a little underwhelming for such an iconic character. Carrie fights Actrice, and it's probably the most clever boss in the game. She surrounds herself with crystals while pestering you with magic, and you need to shatter the differently colored crystals to make an opening to hit her. It's also incredibly easy and lasts like 3 minutes, but it's a bit more involved than just jump whipping death, I suppose. The final real stage is the Clock Tower. Shouldn't this have come before the death fight? I actually kind of like this one. For one, all but the highest falls are not instant death. This is the last level to have platforming in this game, by the way. The first level in the game only has instant death platforming. What did they mean by this? The level is decently fun, it's almost enemy free, and the rotating gears are a nice balanced challenge. It's a short but sweet send-off to the platforming that probably should have been used as a baseline for the rest of the game. I love not dying on every jump. Finally, there's the Castle Keep. a long series of boss fights, including both optional fights. If you spent 30,000 gold in Renon's shop, you get to fight him. You will not fight him unless you are very intentionally spending a ridiculous amount of time grinding. In my initial playthrough, I barely spent $20,000, and I was dawdling about and exploring a lot. I was getting hit constantly, low on resources. The fight is also apparently just a copy-pasted death with a different design. In the more likely scenario, Renon will simply thank you for your patronage and head out, as he plans on selling weapons to both sides in an upcoming World War. You're a few years early, buddy. Maybe it's a holdover from the previous World War II setting, although his outro is charming. If you took 16 in-game days to reach this point, you also get to fight Vincent, who's been turned into a vampire himself as he went ahead without you. Like with Renon, this is borderline impossible to see playing normally, and you'd basically need to stand around in a corner for like 10 hours to fight him, or buy and spam a ton of sun and moon cards, which are mostly useless items that change the time of day. He's apparently just a vampire with evil holy water he spams against you. Finally, it's Dracula time. He works kinda like he did in Symphony of the Night's opening. He needs to be hit in the face, turns into mist to teleport around, and shoots off various magical barrages. It can be a pain in the ass for Reinhardt especially, since every time you die you lose all your power-ups, and the level 1 whip really doesn't do shit to him. Although you can whip or sword some of his projectiles to get healing items or power-ups, which really helped me get through this. Carrie has almost no issues decimating him, especially as her charge shot homes in on his face and does significantly more than the whip, even unpowered up. This fight is fine, tedious but fine, and of course this isn't the real Dracula. It's Guy de Reyes, some real-life French guy who is buddies with Joan of Arc, killed a bunch of children, and I guess he's Dracula's butler or something. However, if Vincent died, the game ends here with the bad endings. Reinhardt takes Malice back to the village with him, whose eyes glow evilly. Carrie marries Malice, who turns her into his vampire bride, eventually. Malice is the real Dracula. How unexpected, as he turns himself from a kid into an anime pretty boy for a real fight. A really easy fight. He teleports around and throws weak projectiles at you, you sword them away and hit him in the face. Again, it's a fairly weak climax, and then Vincent comes out and stops you from falling for Malice's tricks, setting him on fire with holy water. It's then time for Dracula's true form, and instead of the fairly standard looking demon in prior games, it's a giant Yu-Gi-Oh! Fusion monster dragon. It looks straight out of Arc V. That's literally a less colorful Starving Venom fusion dragon, sans the Konami orbs. This fight is fucking terrible though. He spams attacks that knock half your health off, and it's just a tedious war of attrition. You can get to a certain spot inside of his tail where most or all of his attacks can't hit you, but it's really just about having enough health to say fuck you no to all of his attacks and mashing attack on him. It's a cool finale visually, but not all that fun. And with that, Reinhardt marries a reincarnated Rosa, brought back by the power of love, I guess, and Carrie visits her mother's grave, which is a nice and well-shot moment, and that's it. The game, expectedly for something so unfinished, just kinda ends. It's also worth noting that there's an easy mode, which stops midway through the game and tells you to start over, and there's also a hard mode where you get less drops, or no drops, and you just have to buy pickups from Renon, which sounds fucking miserable. Castlevania is a bad game. It's unfinished, it's clunky, it plays badly. The platforming is way too cruel, the game is almost always tedious, and worse in some parts. Music borders on non-existent, levels for the cut characters are just haphazardly thrown in. But also, it's kinda cool. I would never recommend playing it, and I can understand why most people quit at the hedge maze, even though I like that part, or even more so at the castle center for very obvious reasons. But I think there's some cool stuff here. The intro is deceptively strong, the villa is what the game should have been, the designs of bosses and characters are incredible, and the game usually looks pretty damn good, if a bit samey in the back half. But it's such a slog to get through, even for like a 3-hour game. If you want to see the cool stuff, I'd probably recommend cheating. Emulate, use save states to make your own checkpoints, because the game sure as hell won't. There's times where it almost feels worth it to try this game, but it's such a fucking mess. A fascinating one, but an unfinished mess all the same. Most of what you've heard about is true. It's painful, exhausting, tedious, difficult in all the bad ways. And it's such a shame because it occasionally shows glimpses that it could have been something much, much more than that. Evidently, someone agreed that it could have been more, because Castlevania Legacy of Darkness exists and is one of the most bizarre games ever released. Released in December 1999, just under a year after Castlevania, the game is a prequel to the original, bringing back Cornell from the cutting room floor and making him the main focus of the game, with a smaller campaign for Henry, a new gun-toting character who replaces the cut collar. That's a ridiculously short production cycle, even more so when you realize this game also includes a full remake of the first game built in. I think a full remake less than a year after the original on the same console may very well be a record. It's an oddity for sure, but the big question is, what's new, what's changed, and did they actually fix the game? Cornell's the biggest gameplay shakeup and the definite focus of the game, as his campaign is used to unlock Henry's, who unlocks all the others. It also happens to be the longest by far, but also ditches the time limit for good and bad endings, and is just a game. All of this freed them up to make time cards quote-unquote useful, and time doors are fucking everywhere. One whole level centers on them. I'd rather say they hadn't. Cornell's a much more aggressive character than the prior two. The game almost becomes a beat-em-up in his hands. His primary weapon is a magical slash that comes out fast, hits hard, and has crazy range, although unlike Carrie's projectile, it lacks tracking, so it becomes a timing game. His claw slashes, which are his short sword equivalent, also feel a bit stronger and faster, more integral to his toolkits, and levels are tweaked to accommodate this playstyle with much more combat focus, less platforming, substantially so, and much kinder platforming when there is. The game feels kinder in general. The climb has been substantially tweaked to make it more generous. You can basically grab things that are entirely behind you now. I never missed a single grab and felt way more confident going for it, even if it could still be a touch finicky. The action camera is now the default, and the mostly useless normal camera is gone. The battle camera now makes the camera completely stationary, which is weird but useful in niche situations. And the game is generally smoothed out with new designs for most levels that make it way less frustrating, although some of the levels are definitely downgrades. Cornell's big new twist doesn't hurt either, werewolf mode, which can be activated anytime with the L button. Not the most comfortable choice for gameplay with the stick, also the game never tells you about it, and is essentially just a titanic power boost that's insanely busted even when your weapon is at level 1, but stacks with power-ups too to decimate any boss in seconds at the cost of jewels over time. It's comically overpowered, fun as hell, and kind of frustrating as it can't be manually ended. It's all or nothing. It could be a commentary on the uncontrollable nature of the transformation, but also plausibly, they just never finished a command to end it. Cornell's the most fun character hands down, in part due to being kind of overpowered. Also bad transition, but speaking of jewels, sub-weapons have a fun new system too. They can be leveled up by collecting the same one repeatedly. A level 1 dagger is still trash, but each level adds 2 more, multiplying the damage, and adds some kind of effects. Holy water gets more and more insane, the axe calls down lightning as it hits for extra damage, and the cross hits multiple times more reliably and gets an electric effect. It's a great system that adds a ton of depth to the sub-weapons, even if Cornell kind of doesn't need to use sub-weapons at all because he already has unlimited range and wants to save his jewels for werewolf mode, and werewolf mode is substantially better than even the best sub-weapons. Still, it's a fun addition for the other guys, even if you also lose these levels on death, so you're almost never going to be above like level 1, maybe level 2. After beating the campaign, a new one is unlocked for the other new guy, Henry, who's really something. He's a knight, but instead of something more knightly, I guess, he uses a fucking gun. A revolver, in fact. Unlike Carrie and even Cornell, his range attack is very nearly instantaneous. With little to no travel time, you kinda just mash away and everything in your general vicinity dies. Especially funny in a room full of bats. Although most enemies don't spawn or spawn in extremely small numbers in his campaign, which makes the whole thing feel eerily empty in a bad way. The only downside is that the gun needs to reload. Typically this happens every 6 shots, but also happens when the gun is put away, which means you can mix in some short sword swings to go full unlimited ammo on anything. It's hilariously ill-fitting and poorly thought out, and amusing to no end to run up to a skeleton and dump 11 bullets into it. Henry's campaign also has a significantly different structure as opposed to the others. He plays through 6 levels looking for kidnapped children hidden throughout, with each one rescued unlocking a new bonus such as hard mode, Carrie and Reinhardt's campaigns, and alternate costumes, which is a fun reward that also means he doesn't engage much with the game. He plays through the Forest of Silence, Castle Wall, and Villa pretty straightforwardly. Although every door is unlocked, so there's no real thinking, just a lot of looking around for slight hints of the kids, and trying to move relatively quickly as this game has a 7-day in-game time limit that you will almost certainly not run into. At the end of the villa, the coffin that normally goes to the next level can be used to warp to 3 different levels, with crystals in them warping you back. The outer wall, the underground waterway, and the tunnel, and once all the kids are found, it very abruptly ends. The only mandatory boss Henry faces is the giant skeleton, and the story lasts at worst like an hour. In a game that already feels unfinished, it's kind of remarkable that Henry's campaign is somehow even less finished. A bad minigame stapled onto some old levels with no unique bosses, about 5 seconds of story. His intro is the same as Cornell's, and I think the supposition is that Harry is very slightly following in his footsteps, as the conclusion is great job getting those kids out of the castle before it collapsed at the end of Cornell's story, and it sort of feels like they made the character and Konami said, alright, this is a terrible idea, let's wrap it up, you got 3 days. It's very embarrassing. As for Reinhardt and Carrie, they're pretty much unchanged. They each get to go through Cornell's opening level. Reinhardt's level 3 whip has a snazzy new animation where it becomes a whip of light, and Carrie can charge a second magic projectile while her first is still flying around, which is a huge benefit to the pacing of her levels. But things honestly haven't changed that much beyond adopting Cornell's layouts for levels that have been redesigned. There's not a whole lot to say presentation-wise either. A lot of what's here is stuff that was in the original. The areas that existed before, even if redesigned, used many of the same assets, and much of the music is unchanged, although thankfully there's quite a bit more music this time around. The boat is a nice, albeit short, diversion into something very different, although the other 2 new levels are pretty unremarkable. A few old levels also have some cool new elements sprinkled in, namely the clock tower's face. The game also supports the N64 expansion pack, a relative rarity, and even rarer, it's optional, bumping up the resolution at cost of performance, allegedly. Although I didn't test it myself, I'd rather have the performance in a game that already has a few performance issues, although less so than the original Castlevania on the console, admittedly. Cornell's campaign begins 8 years before the events of Castlevania. He's a beastman who watches his village get destroyed and his sister kidnapped by Dracula's forces for unclear reasons. I'm still not fully sure I understand, honestly. The game begins on an entirely new level, the Foggy Lake, which is also given to Reinhardt and Carrie as an intro, although it's the only wholly new level they get, adding only a few minutes for them, where Cornell's story is by far the longest. The boat traveling the lake is fairly unique, something far from the stone walls of most of the castle, and serves nicely as a tutorial with a pretty minimal amount of enemies, safe platforming with heights too small to cause fall damage, some forced ledge climbing, and all the other stuff to give you a bit of a chance to acclimate before getting insta-killed on the first jump. It's not an interesting level to play through, it's like 10 minutes long, has one cool set piece with the flooded room, and you're in and out before you know it, but it's an effective intro for teaching the game. Also, I recognize that guy. The water dragon is a fun little boss to end the level on too, hanging out in the background as you run back and forth on a bridge to position yourself away from its attacks, which is very unique among bosses in this game, with a great sense of scale and even presence as the camera lingers on its floating corpse as you transition to the next level. It's all very neat. The Forest of Silence is the level hurt most by its redesign. On some elements, it's a bit stronger. It has a cool shortcut that skips some of the middle part, which is unique for the game. The platforming's toned down a bit to be safer, but keeps the main ideas, and the skeleton boss has a few new moves, like a big jump that creates a shockwave, but the level is stripped of a lot of its more interesting stuff. Its design is much less open, much more a series of hallways. The great atmosphere is all but gone. The rain and lightning striking the trees that made the level seem so impressive off the bat are gone. The whole level somehow seems unfinished, which is insane since the original version was one of the few levels in the original game that actually did feel finished. There are several other levels that received way less reworking that deserved it far more than the Forest did. And because Reinhardt and Carrie go through Cornell's version of levels, it sticks out as a new sore spot for their remake too. The castle wall, almost entirely unchanged. Same platforming focus, same layout, same gimmicks, same boss. The only major change is exclusive to Cornell, and that his towers are blocked by sun and moon doors, which functionally just serve to obnoxiously waste time instead of increasing pressure due to his lack of alternate endings, and it also serves to introduce Ortega, a fellow beastman who betrayed the village for power under Dracula, who Cornell shares a Dante-Virgil-like relationship, although he is pretty quickly disregarded until the late game, and you're just not going to see him again for a while. The villa, thank God, is almost entirely unchanged. The layout is the same, its beautiful presentation is the same, but Cornell interacts with it slightly differently, and given he has all the time in the world to do so, it makes what was already the best part of the game even better, and adds some freshness with minimal work. Rosa is far from being a vampire yet, so the main NPCs interacted with here are Mary and Henry, the wife and son of the owner of the villa, Oldry, who has fallen to vampirism but is quickly killed, with the main goal of getting Henry out, although Mary is left behind for no good reason. Cornell could have saved her. And of course, getting Henry out means another trip to the maze, although only the gardener is present, no dogs. In reversal, instead of following Henry, he follows you. Yeah, it's an escort mission. He walks so damn slow, it's really tedious. But Champ sure can take a hit, like 5 chainsaw blows from a giant monster man. I'm a werewolf and can barely take 2. The camera, or more so the way the battle camera is now, just an awkward fixed camera mode, makes it very hard to tell where the gardener is before he's already hitting Henry. But it's truthfully not the worst thing ever if you know the route already. You can kinda just brute force it. I did it on my first try. Still, it's admittedly worse than what the original maze offered, if only slightly. Despite that, exploring the villa is still one of the game's highlights, and you even get to fight a younger Zareyas in the crypt at the end. He's basically a normal vampire here, but in Reinhardt and Carrie's campaign, he's the fake Dracula before fighting Malice, which is a fun connection. Actrice also shows up, which is cool, I guess. While Reinhardt and Carrie still go to the tunnel and underground waterway respectively, those levels remain virtually unchanged due to low priority, although each one does get a new boss at the end, which is kinda cool despite making the transition to the castle center even more jarring. Reinhardt fights a giant spider with a great design. Its initial form is stationary and therefore very weak to holy water, but it kinda jump scares you when it revives and turns into a weird vertical centipede thing that's way more aggressive and mobile. It's a pretty decent fight. Carrie instead fights Medusa, a recurring fight in the series, and another pretty good one actually, as she's rather dynamic, quickly shifting between a standard form where she tries to poison you or slow you down by spawning piles of snakes that latch onto you, a shield form which lets her block most attacks, not holy water though, and throwing spears. The cramped area is a bit difficult for Carrie to work in, which can be a bit annoying, but the boss is interesting for probably being the one with the most dynamism in either game. While I'm at it, the last level Cornell never goes to is the castle center. Thank fucking god. Because somehow they made it even more obnoxious, if only slightly. Reinhardt exclusively has the motorcycle skeletons dropped for hellhounds, which are substantially faster, more aggressive, and punishing. As for changes affecting both original characters, the weird blood creatures spawn all over in the elevator room, even when carrying the nitro. The vampires on the lower floor always respawn, which adds a few seconds to each trip, and enemies are placed in a few other spots that they weren't before. Someone really sat down and said, you know what? This level wasn't tedious or long enough, better add a little more. The magical nitro stuff, that's all perfect, no need to change a thing. It boggles the mind a bit. Anyway, Cornell follows the villa and the outer wall, a scramble on the exterior of Dracula's castle. Despite the fact that you go down a coffin at the end of the last level, the outer wall sounds like it should be a cool departure, but it's mostly more of the same, grey bricks with a few sloped roofs to slide down. The level isn't insanely creative, but thanks in part to the improved platforming and a few clever segments, even a level that's almost all platforming can be a decently good time in this version of the game. The RP boss is a bit more interesting for being unique if nothing else. Flying enemies are pretty much limited to bats otherwise, and I guess death, kinda, but it puts Cornell's moves to a decent test since he's so range focused. Cornell then goes through all 6 towers. Yep, 2 new ones, 4 old ones, in a row. There's a good amount of variety between them, but it does kinda go on and on. It drags a little bit. The first new one, Art Tower, is pretty terrible. It might be the new worst level in the game. Definitely the worst level in Cornell's campaign. A series of sun and moon doors that require farming cards from enemies in the stage to get anywhere. I think the minimum amount of cards you need is 9, so you spend most of the stage in menus watching the clock go up, which is an immense, tedious pace breaker, especially when the actual gameplay is 2 very short, gimmicky platforming segments on elevators. The final gallery area with the giant chandeliers is a neat visual, but the tightrope walk is way too precise for this game. It really does not feel good. The second new tower, the Runes Tower, is also really bad and tedious, just differently so. The Egyptian-themed area, which is almost comically off the wall, but also kinda comically Castlevania, consists of a bunch of rooms interlinked, with a good majority of them being booby-trapped to dump you into a basement area that resets your progress. And some of these booby-trapped rooms are further mandatory traps that either need to be jumped across arbitrarily, or need to be fallen into to reach buttons that open the path ahead. It becomes an exercise in memorizing the entire layout of the facility and attempting to make sense of vague maps to push through, and depending on your ability to memorize layouts, of which I have none, will be a living hell. And of course it continues on to a lengthy run across platforms that may or may not collapse arbitrarily with no way to tell, which is just another tedious layer on the cake, and ends with an astrology puzzle. I know nothing about astrology, I don't get it, I just looked it up, I don't care. The Tower of Science falls in a limbo between feeling more and less finished. The outer portion is nearly identical with the conveyor belts and such, and the inside is similarly a maze of turrets, but this one focuses much less on the platforming and more so on fighting a ton of turrets, which have been made more aggressive and accurate. However, this new design comes at the cost of some of the more interesting things that the tower had, like the wall turret point of view scene and the giant glass jars with creatures inside. It's not a horrendous redesign, it's largely just kinda bland, and the boss is probably the stupidest in the game, a giant crystal surrounded by a variety of invincible turrets that needs to be pounded on. The wolf transformation can kill it in literally 2 seconds. It's really bad in Carrie's version though, because all of the turrets keep redirecting her magical blasts, and it becomes really obnoxious to actually land hits. The science tower has just become an area in the game with the least to say about it probably. The Duel Tower, on the other hand, is just straight up fixed. No longer a tower with ultra precise jumps, it maintains the core idea but with slightly more interesting twists. 4 mini-bosses, the other beastmen, although instead of the tiger, Cornell's finale is a giant werewolf who lost control of his powers, introduced by Ortega, and which honestly isn't that different from the others, just harder to play keep away with because of its size. The connective tissue is what's really changed, centering itself on rotating spikes again, but this time with less cruel jumps, checkpoints, how the fuck did they not have them last time, and the introduction of vertically spinning bars, which are a bit more interesting to play around than the horizontal ones. The level is still short and honestly forgettable, but it's an improvement over being short, forgettable, and frustrating, I suppose. The Tower of Execution is more or less a new level, with the only real connective tissue being the lava. The actual tower part is scrapped entirely, it runs way better for it though, and it's a pretty simple platforming gauntlet with swinging axes, lava plumes, and giant boulders creating large splashes of lava. These do jank up the frame rate a tiny bit, but only in very short bursts, so it's tolerable. While I will say it's much less interesting than its prior incarnation, at least in terms of the centralized tower concept, it's a fairly fun level and brief, although again, not very notable in the grand scheme of things. Finally, the Tower of Sorcery, more or less a side grade on its original form. The vanishing platforms are used less, but moving crystals appear and present their own challenges. Platforming is a little more generous in both design and general mechanics, but evil crystals also try to snipe you from a distance. Either way, the slight decrease in difficulty is pretty apparent and probably preferable, and the neat Kingdom Hearts atmosphere remains intact. And that gets us to the first big boss at the Room of Clocks. The original duo still fight their own bosses and feel mostly the same. Ectries felt a bit easier, but I could just have had some better luck and have higher skill now. Cornell finally gets to fight as Virgil Ortega, who reveals that he never actually gave Cornell's sister to Dracula for sacrifice, but just wanted to be a proper rival for Cornell. It's extremely dumb anime and kinda undermined by not being a real Virgil fight. I know this game predates DMC, but still. This isn't a 1 versus 1 against an evenly matched and similarly abled foe. Ortega turns into a chimera, and it's a cool design, but also comes out of nowhere and is way less cool than a proper rival fight would be. Ortega Chimera is a fun fight too. Its Psychic Blast attack reverses your controls temporarily, which is a silly and unique mechanic. It lunges around, flies away, although it can hang out of range for pretty long periods of time, which gets tiring. It also gets mulched by wolf form, as everything does, but regardless, it's a nice enough penultimate battle. The clock tower is greatly extended, and honestly, I think the new stuff is great. After going through the same first 2 rooms, there's a variety of new stuff. Long climbs and rotating towers, which I find very fun, plenty of extra gear segments, and a really unique point where you jump across swinging pendulums, plus the clock face set piece is really neat visually. It does get a little tiring admittedly. Cornell's campaign is already the longest by far, and the other 2 also definitely feel the extension of this level at the end of their stories too. Still, it's a pretty nice send-off for the platforming, especially given how much better it's gotten in this game. Without multiple endings, there's no Vincent to worry about. The only secret boss is Renan. The length of Cornell's story makes it more reasonable that you'd see him, and the game gives out money more often to try to force it, but you do kind of bump into a different issue. If you're decent at the game, and because Cornell's combat is pretty keep away and frankly easy, you probably aren't going to have to buy much. You only ever really need to buy beef, and I walked into this fight stocked up. You could intentionally make Renan show up, and even as a death clone, he's unique for Cornell. You would kind of have to work to intentionally make Renan show up. That said, the big battle's against Dracula. Wait, hold on. I thought he was dead for 100 years before the original game, and that's why he was a little 10-year-old boy. What's his plan again here? Is this an astral projection? A fake? Anyway, his first phase plays out exactly like the fake Dracula in the original game. That's a mighty big coincidence if I do say so, but also the battle camera no longer focusing on enemies makes this fight way more disorienting. There's no middle form or really pomp and circumstance. After defeating the really easy first fight, Dracula becomes a Final Fantasy final boss, Ultimate Dracula. Honestly, the design is kinda terrible. The stomach face is a little too awkward in this setting, and he kinda just looks like a big angel thing. The fight is frankly insane. You're given about 5 feet to walk around in, you're asked directly to the camera, while Dracula stands about 2 feet from you, dropping lightning and fire from the heavens on you, like a Final Fantasy N boss, and occasionally shifting into the background for a few attacks that need to be destroyed with your own attacks. It's a clusterfuck. Your ability to dodge is extremely limited, and you need to wait for tiny gaps to sneak hits in. It feels basically impossible to make real decisions in. You just go wolf mode, spin around, heal off every 60% damage hit, and kill him in 5 hits of your own, or like a million if you're not in wolf form. I question if this boss had any testing. It feels like the last thing made out of obligation when the production was getting shut down. As Dracula dies, or whatever is going on, he steals Cornell's wolf form, turning him into a regular human and giving Dracula the ability to come back to life as Malice via spell, ectrice, and deathcast. So I guess he was always dead and a ghost or something. I don't know anymore. Why you fight Dracula is a complete mystery to me. With the world saved for now, Cornell, his sister, and Henry, the Villa kid, go off to start a new life. I suppose it's cute to tie it back, but it is a little out of nowhere. Is Legacy of Darkness a better game than Castlevania? Yeah, pretty much beat for beat. There's a few missteps here and there, like the forest, but just fixing up the platforming keeps the whole thing together way better. There's some levels that were better as they were and would have benefited from the improved mechanics without having to do too much work to them, but the fact that the game is now fairly reliable is fucking huge. Despite having areas, bosses, and elements that are still clearly unfinished despite this being like the definitive cut, the game looks pretty good, it mostly feels good, and I can't help but feel Castlevania is a game that never should have existed. This game got mauled by reviews where Castlevania itself got pretty decent ones, and that can mostly be blamed on the amount of reused concepts, bosses, themes, and other content. This game seems terrible in context. A scam dropped less than a year after the original, reusing so much from that original, and yet if Castlevania never existed, I can't help but feel this game would be remembered decently fondly, regarded as a hidden gem in the way neither ended up getting to because this game is overshadowed by the first game, which itself is pretty rough and unfinished. And people project those flaws on Legacy of Darkness because of the context. Legacy of Darkness isn't a great game, but it's a decent one, and an interesting attempt to modernize Castlevania for the time. An endeavor they would never really try again, with the other 3D games after this falling more in line with character action games like DMC and God of War, which were very popular at the time. It's hard to separate Legacy of Darkness and Castlevania, and the remake situation is so ridiculous that it dominates most of what people do know about this game, but for what it's worth, it deserves to be recognized more for being an interesting experiment if nothing else. It's so close to being a good game that if it didn't have the baggage, it might just have made it.